So I believe now we are online. Just to let everyone know, let me check the YouTube channel. Yes, we're live. But we can still, just to let you know, we can still talk about each other, just not, you know, going forward to the the actual opening, and obviously we can chat around a bit. And Professor Kotzur, actually, I was last year, not last year, because, you know,
yeah,
but 2 years ago, I was in Hamburg, actually.
Oh, great. So what a pity that we did not meet each other. That is...
Yes, I went because there is an arbitration competition that happens every year, and now they have the Hamburg pre-moot over there.
Yeah,
so
lovely.
I went to several hearings and in the different law firms, and also but obviously I did some tours. I went to the Philharmonica, which is really interesting building.
Lovely. No, great. So I'm very happy to hear that, and I hope that you will come back, you know, after traveling is possible again. So please,
yes,
feel already now cordially invited, and also, of course, all the others. It'd be my pleasure, you know, to welcome guests from Brazil. Ingo Zalet, you know, you might know him.
Yes.
Now a guest in Hamburg, and he established.
Oh, I didn't know that he was a guest currently.
Yeah, he was there about 1 year ago, before the last lockdown came. So he is a regular visitor to Hamburg.
Oh, that's interesting.
Close connections to some other colleagues of mine here at the faculty. Marion Albers, she does in particular, you know, information law and media law. And so we had a common project about, you know, the right to privacy protection and media law in a comparative perspective.
Oh.
Germany, the European Union, and Brazil. So we did that.
Oh, this is really interesting.
Years ago. So interesting.
But actually,
going on.
Yes, but apart from you, I really know Stefan Kohl, which is from Bucerius. He's I know him for over 10 years.
Oh, great. So he's a very colleague too. So yeah, of course, we got 2 real law faculties in Hamburg, and we got at the University of the Federal Army, we also got a faculty of state sciences and political sciences with some interesting lawyers, and also public international lawyers. So we quite a strong legal community here in Hamburg, with 3 different universities having legal chairs. So that is it's a very nice environment to work and to do research.
Yes, for sure. No, and as I said, I really enjoyed Hamburg. I mean, it's really a really nice place, and the architecture, especially on the Philharmonica, even though it's really modern, but it's really a striking place to be and to properly see, you know, the new wave of architectures.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. We are glad to hear that. So, and Hamburg is very different, you know, the new quarter, the harbor city with the Philharmonic, as you mentioned, and then some other, you know, older parts of the city with very nice older buildings from the 19th century. So I think it's really worthwhile visiting. It's a very green city, in particular in spring and in summertime. Even though, you know, compared to Brazil, our weather is stable, so it can, you know, within one day you can have, you know, all 4 seasons. And even during the summer, it can be, you know, rainy in the morning and a wonderful, splendid sunny afternoon, and then you know, rainy evening again. So one got to be prepared, you know, if one visits. But
yes, it's one of my favorite cities in Germany. It was my first international travel. I made Hamburg before being on Disney. I've been to Hamburg because my aunt lived there.
Very good decision. Very good decision.
I've been there sometimes because of my aunt. She lived there in study, so it's like home for me.
Yeah, no, very good to hear that. And please do come back. So you are really cordially invited. It'd be my great pleasure to welcome you in Hamburg as maybe guest researchers at the faculty or just visitors. So there might be opportunities to do things together. I'd greatly appreciate that.
Let me just double check here. Mariana, if you want to start, we can do it.
For me, it's okay.
Ok, so agora eu vou falar em português e depois eu passo para inglês. Eu estou na tela. Olá a todas e todos, eu sou Jonathan Barros Vita, coordenador e professor titular do PPGD Unimar, Programa de Pós-Graduação em Direito, Mestrado e Doutorado da Universidade de Marília, e é com muito prazer que hoje a gente faz mais uma abertura do evento da professora Mariana, que é um evento tradicional das quartas-feiras, às 14 horas. E hoje, dentro desse processo de internacionalização, a gente recebe o professor Markus Kotzur, que é professor da Universidade de Hamburgo, na Alemanha. E vamos receber, obviamente, também o professor Diogo Oliveira, que também vai participar aqui do nosso evento. Esse evento, dentro desse processo de internacionalização, vai ser um evento em inglês, então isso é bastante importante, mas eu preciso, antes de tudo, e já dando as boas-vindas a todos os que estão aqui, lembrar das nossas atividades de youtuber, né? Segundo a Fernanda, a gente tem de sempre fazer isso. É óbvio que não se esqueçam, para aqueles que não são inscritos, de se inscreverem no canal, clica no sininho para ativar as notificações, curtam esse vídeo, porque aí o YouTube ele vai movimentando o algoritmo em nosso favor, e sigam a gente no Instagram e curtam nossa página no Facebook. Dito isso, a gente tem ainda uma semana bastante cheia aqui no nosso canal. Amanhã, às 9 horas da manhã, vamos receber, com muito prazer, a abertura do congresso da FEPOD. Então, a abertura oficial será amanhã, com o professor Otávio, a presidente Sinara vai estar presente da FEPOD, junto com uma série de outras autoridades, como a professora Lívia, a professora Fernanda, que é pró-reitora na UFMI, a professora Fernanda, que é pró-reitora na Unimar, o representante do Comped, o Lucas, e o representante da APG, que é a Associação dos Pós-Graduandos. E eu também vou estar. Na sexta-feira, a gente recebe também um painel da FEPOD, também sexta-feira, às 9 da manhã, então vai ser também um painel bastante interessante, com a participação da professora Mariana, sobre o DDES. Próxima segunda, a gente vai ter o Café com Egressos pré-início de aulas, né? Então, os nossos egressos de sucesso, comandados aí pela Catarina e pela Jaqueline, vão receber outros egressos para justamente falar um pouco da expectativa de como vai ser o início do nosso semestre, já que nossas aulas começam dia 27 e próxima quarta, com certeza, a gente está aqui às 14 horas no evento da professora Mariana. Dito tudo isso, agora eu vou falar em inglês e vou receber os nossos convidados. Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Barros Vita. I'm the director and full professor of the PhD and Master's program of University of Marília, and it's really a great pleasure to receive all of you in the event from Professor Mariana, and I'm really glad to do the opening statements here, and obviously I'll come back and do some, give some pointers and give my feedback on the great lecture that I'm expecting for Professor Markus Kotzur. He is coming from the University of Hamburg, And we were talking before, I was really glad to go to Hamburg before. It's a really nice city. And I'm looking forward to a time that we can travel and go again to that beautiful city. And also I would like to welcome Professor Diogo Oliveira. And the subject today is constitutional thought in Germany. And for sure, it will be really, really an interesting lecture. And I'm looking forward to coming back on a later stage and give some feedback on that. Thank you very much, Mariana.
Professor Jonathan, thank you so much. Hello everyone. My name is Mariana Santiago. I am professor of the postgraduate program in law at the University of Marília. I hope you all are well and safe in these difficult times of pandemic that we are living, especially in Brazil. We are starting now our weekly event titled Dialogues on Development, Company and Society. It's an event organized by the University of Marília to our students, but it's now completely open to all the law community. I see that we have with us today students and professors from different places in Brazil. So welcome everybody. This event has the invaluable support of the International Law Institute from the dear Professor Maria Helena Diniz, the biggest one in Brazil, also with the support of the Brazilian Bar Association, São Paulo section, and the Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul. Thank you so much for that support. This is a pleasure today to have with us Professor Dr. Markus Kotzur. He is professor and pro-dean for international relations at Universität Hamburg in Germany. His lecture will be about constitutional thought in Germany, and the subject is extremely important, and he's in line with that we work in the University of Marília. And in fact, it's part of our legal culture in Brazil. I would like to mention the presence of Professor Dr. Diogo Oliveira from University of Marília, and he's also federal judge in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. He will discuss the topic with us in a dialogue. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, Professor Elias Marx had an emergency today, and he will not join us at the event. So finally, I wish everyone a great experience, and Professor Markus, feel free to start the lecture. We look forward to hearing you. Thank you once again. It's a great honor for us to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for your kind invitation. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to have that lecture and to be able to talk to you, to hopefully talk and discuss with your students and to share some insights and some perspectives on constitutional thought in Germany. I think it's extremely important to do that in a comparative perspective, because if we talk to other legal cultures, if there is interchange in between legal cultures, from a comparative angle, we can learn quite a lot from each other. And I think that is in particularly exciting about what we do tonight, that, you know, I can tell you something about constitutional thought, not only in Germany, but also in Europe, within the European Union. And of course, it's exciting to learn more about constitutional thought in Brazil, in other Latin American countries. And we should be aware that in the globalized world of the 21st century, the constitutional thought in all parts of the world is influenced by, you know, constitutional thoughts from other countries, from other legal cultures. That is, I think, a very important preliminary remark. To give you a structure of my lecture, I will try to share my screen with you. Hopefully that works. It looks like, and if you can follow that structure, it's a very simple structure. It's only 2 slides. You can see what you are going to expect tonight. I will start the lecture with, some historical remarks on the German variant of constitutionalism and constitutional thought in the 19th century. Then I will continue to introduce constitutional thought under the Weimar Constitution of 1919 with the most influential thinkers of that period, and they are still very influential today. I will then turn to today's constitutional thought, today's theories about what a constitution is, how a constitution looks like, and I will here emphasize in particular the constitutional theory and the constitutional teachings of Peter Heberle, who is very well known in Brazil and who sends his best regards from Germany. He is, I think, one of the most influential constitutional lawyers and constitutional thinkers, not only in Germany, but worldwide. And I'm very happy to also share some of his thoughts with you. I will then turn to the concept of a European constitution, the idea whether the European Union can, in addition to the member states, also be constitutionalized. And my last perspective will be global constitutionalism and constitutional pluralism, the way we discuss and debate in Germany and in Europe the question whether also the international community can have something such as a constitution. Let me start with my first point, and before I do that, I also would like to let know all the participants of that lectures, all students, that you are welcome to raise any kind of questions and share with me your questions and your thoughts. You can do that during the lecture, you can do that after the lecture. I'm very happy to, if I can, answer questions or, try to, look up things for you if I can't answer the questions you might have. So let me start with the historical outline. If we talk about a modern constitution, about constitutionalism, I think you are very well aware that constitutional thought in the modern sense starts with the American Revolution and the French Revolution. These two revolutions had the strongest impact on the very idea of a constitution. And that was not by accident, because both the Americans and the French wanted to overcome the old monarchies. And in a monarchy, of course, the king was legitimized by the grace of God. If you now want to overcome the monarchies and replace the king as the God-given ruler by another ruling entity, you need a source of legitimacy for that new ruling entity. And of course, in France and in the US, it was the people who should be the sovereign, who should be the rulers. And to legitimize the power exercised by the people, the very idea of a constitution was introduced. As of its very beginnings, the constitution had the aim and the purpose to legitimize political power, to legitimize public authority. And in the same moment, not only to legitimize it, but also to make its exercise possible, to limit and to control its exercise. That's the big lecture, that's the big lesson that we learn from both the American and the French Revolution. The American and the French ideas were also influential in Germany in the 19th century. But the German history at that period of time was not very open to the ideas of a democracy. The monarchy, the monarchic principle, was still very strong in Germany and prevailed. And after the French Revolution, after the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, the states in Europe tried to re-establish the old regime. And in Germany, the idea was to definitely keep monarchies. for the Germans, it was very difficult to understand that now all of a sudden there should not be a God-given ruler anymore. That was out of the political horizon of that time in Germany. So the German states, the different kingdoms and dukeships and so on, they decided we definitely want to stick to the monarchic principle and we want to keep that order. However, they also had the idea that in re-establishing the old order, political power needed to be a bit more formalized, that constitutions should be introduced. So the very idea that something such as a constitution existed became also popular in Germany. However, not in the sense of a democratic constitution, but in the sense of a cooperative constitution, in which the king or the princeps, by the grace of God, granted the constitution to his people and granted their participation, at least to some and to a limited extent, their participation in ruling, in lawmaking processes. So what in particular became strong in Germany in that period of time was the idea of a rule of law, that all public authority should be to some extent exercised within legal venues, within a legal infrastructure, and that to some extent also civil rights should be granted to the people. However, a democracy was at that time not at the very core of the German constitution. In the middle of the 19th century, in 1848 and 1849, Germany also experienced some kind of a revolution. At that time, the Germans tried to establish a more democratic constitution. They still did not want to give up the idea of a monarchy, but they wanted to establish a real constitutional monarchy with a strong parliament. And they wanted to build a true federal state, a federal system. Because, you know, the former Holy Roman Empire had been dissolved after 1806. And now Germany was, you know, frankly speaking, in a very messy situation, you know, all these little states and kingdoms, you know, some of them being powerful, such as Prussia, others very small and little, and kind of, you know, difficult to be organized. And therefore there was the desire also in Germany to build a nation state, to build a federal state. And the attempt was made in 1848, 1849 to build a nation state, to build a federation, a monarchy under the Prussian leadership, but with true democratic elements. However, at the end of the day, and history is very complex, I can't give you any details because then, you know, that would not be 1 hour and one evening, that would continue for kind of, you know, days or weeks. It failed, you know. Germany was not yet ready for a real democratic form of government, and the constitution of 1848, 1849 was not a success. It took another more than 20 years until Germany became in 1871. You might have heard of that if you are interested a bit in constitutional history and in comparative constitutional history. Only in 1871, Germany became unified as a nation state, and it was a unification driven by wars, driven by, you know, defending oneself against foreign enemies. And Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia at that time, was the most influential politician in Germany who made that constitution and that reunification possible. However, it was not a democratic constitution in the modern sense. It was a constitution that still was based upon the monarchic principle. The Prussian king became now the German emperor. The German Empire was founded as a monarchy and only very little democratic participation. However, elements of the rule of law and of civil rights were already existing. So to make a long story short, in the 19th century, constitutional thought had indeed developed also in Germany, but not in the modern sense of a democratic constitution, but in a somewhat pre-modern sense of a limited and controlled form of monarchic government, which was not based on the democratic principle, but on the monarchic principle, but which, and that was the modern part of it, had introduced some element of civil rights, and in particular, federal architectural structures and the rule of law. The next step, the time after the First World War, and that's quite, some historical step, but that was the time when modern constitutional thought in Germany really came into being. If you are a bit familiar with history, interested in history, then you know the First World War was a big disaster for Europe. It started in 1914. It was a war where Germany and Austria fought against France, against the United Kingdom and against Russia, and later on also the United States of America got involved. And at the end of the day, Germany was the big loser of that war. And the German, and in particular the Prussian state, the Prussian ideal of a state came at its end. There was, of course, internal forces in Germany, in particular the laborers and the Social Democratic Party who wanted to change, who wanted to build a democracy. But there was also external forces. The United States of America, who had participated in the war, said Germany needs to overcome its old monarchic structures. Germany needs to become a democracy. The emperor has to go, the emperor has to be exiled, and a democratic constitution has to be established. Since Germany lost the war, the Germans had to follow these rules, to some extent forced by foreign forces, and to some extent also driven by internal reforms, by social democrats, by people who wanted to build a republic and who wanted to build a constitution. And now things get exciting, In 1919, the Weimar Constitution, the new democratic constitution for the federal state in Germany, was established as a written document, totally changing, the legitimacy and the way how political power was exercised. And as you know, if something fundamental, if a change like that happens, there we need new theories to understand and to conceptualize a constitution. So the leading German lawyers of that time started to think about what is a constitution, to define a constitution in the modern sense. And this is the very origin of the strongest and the most influential theories of constitutional thought in Germany. And as you will see, the constitutional theories developed at that time, they were very different. There were very strong and very harsh controversies about what a constitution is and how a constitution should look like. You might have heard the four names of the big thinkers of that time who were the leading scholars in constitutional law and who were the most influential thinkers in shaping the ideas of German constitutionalism in the first half of the 20th century. It were Rudolph Smith, Hermann Heller, Hans Kelsen, and Carl Schmitt, who later on became a very difficult jurist under the Nazi regime and helped to establish and enforce the Nazi regime. Therefore, he has to be seen very critical. But in the early years, he was an influential and a very smart thinker, also trying to describe what a constitution is. Let us start with Rudolph Smith. Having experienced, the dramatic political changes in Germany, having experienced the war which Germany lost, and having experienced, the revolution, having experienced that German society was, not unified, that they were fighting with each other, that there were people in Germany who were very sad that they lost the emperor, who desired they wanted still to be a monarchy, and others wanted to be a rather leftist democracy, and all these kind of, different tensions needed to be reconciled. And therefore, Rudolph Smith said, a constitution is about integrating a political community. A constitution is the very instrument to build a political community. And Rudolph Smith, I think, made a very important remark. He believed that a constitution never can be finished. Even though at one period in history you draft a document, yes, you have the written text, you have the written text of the American Constitution, of the Brazil Constitution, of the German Constitution, of the Austrian Constitution, of the French Constitution. However, the written text is only the expression of a process that can never be finished, because political integration is ongoing. It is not finished one day, but it continues, It continues along political tensions that we face every day. If, political parties, new political parties gain power in a state, if new leaders gain power in a state, if new political conflicts arise. So political integration is a continuous process happening every day. And Rudolph Smith believed that that process of political integration was to be organized by the means of law. Law, the normative constitution rules were the very instruments to form political integration. Laws about the government, laws about how laws are made, laws about the parliament, laws about fundamental rights, they were governing the process of political integration. In that regard, Rudolph Smith was revolutionarily modern, Never before a German scholar had thought in that procedural way. Never before a German scholar had conceived the constitution as an ongoing, as a continuous political process. However, there is also a shortcoming in Rudolph Smith's theory. He strongly related on the idea of integration, and his ideal of integration was a rather homogeneous political community, a rather homogeneous people. So diversity, pluralism, different values, tensions, open societies, welcoming migrants, etc. That was not within his concept. He was so strongly relying on the very ideal that, integration will finally, build a rather homogeneous political entity that, some people misused his theory, misused his approach to endorse nationalism. The second theory was developed by Hermann Heller. Hermann Heller was a very strong social democrat. He came from the rather left side of the political spectrum, but he was also a brilliant constitutional thinker. And he was, I think, the most modern one out of the four, because he believed that, the constitution would be composed of an institutional part, you know, the state institutions, as I said, the parliament, the government, the courts, you know, the federal council, stuff like that. And that a constitution would be based off procedural content, and that the constitution would form a process of deliberation of the people that would at the end of the day lead to political unity by planned cooperation. So if you compare Heller and Smith, you will see that both had a procedural understanding. They were talking about the constitution forming a process, and that process would lead to societal interaction. But for Heller, deliberation in the sense of a modern, of a pluralist, of a deliberative democracy played a much stronger role. Heller, in that regard, already had seen that, you know, people would not have the same opinions. They would share to a limited extent only the same values, that people would be very individual, and that in a democracy, you need to discuss things, you need to deliberate, you need to find majorities, you need to not discriminate against minorities, you need kind of, on a day-to-day process, negotiate political decisions. And so, in a modern deliberative sense, Heller was, I think, the most modern, and he still is very influential on the way deliberative democracy is constitutionalized today in Germany. The fourth name is maybe the most famous one. It's Hans Kelsen. And Hans Kelsen is not only famous as a constitutional lawyer, but also as a legal theorist, because he is one of the exponents of positivism, believing not in natural law, but in the written norms. And what Hans Kelsen did for constitutional thought in Germany are the following things. Hans Kelsen understood a constitution as the most foundational norm. In German, he spoke of Grundnorm, that would be translated into English foundational law, the very basis of the whole legal order. And Hans Kelsen was also the legal scholar who thought in strict hierarchical categories, you know, the constitution being the paramount law of the land. This is something, you know, which the Americans already believed, you know, more than 100 years earlier, these legal hierarchy, the constitution being the highest law, being the paramount law of the land. That was something that, you know, Hermann Heller strongly believed, Hans Kelsen strongly believed. And Hans Kelsen did something else which is very exciting. Hans Kelsen said, if the constitution is so important, if the constitution is so influential, if the constitution is the basic norm, then you need a court to protect this constitution. And he invented the very idea that there should be an independent constitutional court, independent constitutional jurisprudence. He followed to some extent the American ideas that there should be a constitutional court, that the court should also decide about the constitution, and that there should be something such as judicial review. However, he did not follow the Supreme Court model in the US, that the highest court, you know, would be the highest court in constitutional matters, in administrative matters, in criminal law matters, in civil law matters, but he wanted a separate constitutional court only dealing with constitutional questions. We take that today pretty much for granted, you know. We have constitutional courts. In Germany, you have a very influential, very strong constitutional court. In Brazil, you look at the American Supreme Court and so on. So we take that for granted. But in the early 1920s in Germany, it was quite a revolutionary idea because people thought, wait a minute, you know, we are talking about political processes, we are talking about political integration, we are talking about, you know, what the parliament does, what the government does. So this is political decision-making. And political decision-making should be up to the politicians. This is not, you know, judges' business. So many people said, we don't like that idea of a constitutional court. They were afraid, they were anxious. So in Germany, under the Weimar Constitution, there was no real constitutional court. There was only a state court dealing with very limited conflicts between the federal government and the Länder, the states. But in Austria, the model of Hans Kaisen was developed. They established an independent constitutional court. And that idea, after the Second World War, of course, gained great power and force then in Germany. The last thinker, Carl Schmitt, is, as I said, maybe the most brilliant, but also the most problematic one, because he kind of, you know, got involved with the Nazi regime, and he kind of did not, you know, distinguish himself and separate himself, but he kind of, you know, endorsed also the National Socialist theories, which I think is a very problematic feature. He is a very difficult, a very problematic German lawyer, but still an influential constitutional thinker, not only in Germany, but also in many other countries. And his constitutional thought remained also after the Second World War, after 1945, influential. Carl Schmitt invented the so-called decisionism. What does that mean? Schmitt believed that a constitution is the unique and unbound overall decision once and only on the nature and on the form of a political unity. This is pretty much kind of, you know, mythology. Schmitt believed that a people would at one moment in history, you know, at one very decisive moment in history, decide about their fate, would come to that constitutional decision that then for once and forever would persist, would continue. He did not believe that the constitution was an ongoing political process, but a decision made for once by an independent people, totally unbound from other things. And that this decision then would be concretized in a written text, in a written constitution, and the following generations would have to stick to that constitution and to that constitutional text. So he is the most different constitutional theorist compared to Rudolph Smith and Hermann Teller. A fixed status, a unique decision. The problem with his theory is, you know, in particular, if you look at modern political theories, it's quite strange to believe that people, you know, would make once and forever that decision. You know, how should the people do that? You know, if a constitution is enacted, of course, you might maybe elect a constitutional assembly. There might be drafters of the constitution. You know, somebody might write the constitution, but it's not the people as a methodological entity, as a kind of, you know, homogeneous ideal that then say, oh yes, we want that constitution. It's, you know, as a parliamentary process, it's a disputed, it's a contested process. You know, if you draft the constitution, you have all the political tensions, you know, different political parties want a different content of the constitution. You end up with some kind of a compromise. The constitution is enacted. However, you know, the process of political fighting and the process of political debates continues. I think there is no such thing as the one and only decision, as Carl Schmitt believed. But as I said, his political thought and his constitutional thought is still influential. The Nazi regime put an end to all kind of, constitutional thinking and constitutional theory in Germany. Without formally abolishing the Weimar Constitution, the Nazi regimes totally believed in the leader, and they did not believe that, political power had to be legitimized by a constitution. They found the constitution an obstacle, something new. Forget it, you can't get away with it. It's not at all important. So constitutional thought did not play any role under the National Socialist ideology, establishing the most horrible, I think, tyranny and human rights forgotten regime we ever experienced in humankind's history. So to overcome after 1945 this Nazi regime, it was quite clear that Germany had to restart with a constitution, that Germany had to again become a constitutional state. And once more, in that most decisive moment in history, the leading scholars, the leading lawyers, the leading theorists, the leading constitutional theorists were reflecting, were thinking about the concept of a constitution. And as in 1919, they again asked the question, what are the most important functions of a constitution? And what should be the most important contents of a constitution? Let me address the functions first. As already had been said in the first part of the 20th century in Germany, it's also now said that the most important function of a constitution is to legitimize the exercise of public power, of public authority. If authority is not God-given, if authority has to be rationally legitimized, you need to document, you need a foundational instrument to give that legitimacy. And of course, Germany followed the idea of Rousseau, of a democracy, of democratic sovereignty. Next to legitimizing public authority, a constitution, that's the second function, needs to help to organize the polity, needs to establish a government, needs to establish institutions and procedures, in particular, procedures how laws shall be made, how laws shall be enacted. And a constitution needs to limit and to control the exercise of public power. In particular, the balance of powers, the separation of powers instrument. Legitimizing, organizing, limiting and controlling the exercise of political power have been established as the key constitutional functions under the German Basic Law, under the Grundgesetz. These are the essential parts of constitutional thought in Germany until today. And next to the functions, of course, people thought about the very contents of a constitution. What should a constitution consist of? And the following elements were identified. A constitution should start off with a preamble that describes the very aim of the following constitution, that tells the grand narrative of a political community, that deals with the future and with the history of a political community. Furthermore, a constitution, and that was, I think, the most important experience from the Nazi regime, a constitution had to comprise human rights guarantees, strong human rights guarantees, that the individual can be protected against the state if the state wants to take freedoms, wants to take liberties, to take maybe even a human being's life. So the human rights part, the fundamental rights part, has been seen as the most important content of a constitution. The second necessary element of a constitution was identified in the foundational principles for a state. And these are democracy and the rule of law. So democracy and the rule of law had to be enshrined in that constitution. So from a content, from the material perspective, there is, as we describe it in Germany, a so-called constitutional trinity. And that constitutional trinity is composed of human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. That's the constitutional trinity. To make that material constitutional trinity work and function, you need procedures and institutions. And therefore, constitutional thinkers also say there is a minimum requirement that the constitution comprises rules, how institutions are established, how the government is established, how the courts are established, and how the administration is established. So that organizational part is also a key content of the Constitution. In the next step and in the following years, of course, that constitutional thought was more and more refined. Very prominent thinkers refining the constitutional framework were Konrad Hesse and Horst Ehmke. And they said a constitution needs to be not too abundant. A constitution needs to be short and precise. It should be limited to the most essential questions forming a political community. And they again came back to my constitutional trinity, which I already described, and said, human rights, rule of law, democracy, that's the triad, and political institutions, the organization of government, respectively governance, that is the important key feature of a constitution, and other things a constitution should not discuss, other things a constitution should not encompass. That is the kind of, basic foundational architecture of constitutional thought in Germany. In the 1960s and in the 1970s, Peter Heberle started to become another very prominent voice to further develop the idea of a constitution and constitutional thought in Germany. And I think the most important thing Heberle did, and what the others had not yet done, is to combine constitution and the culture the constitution is embedded in. Heberle started to look at the reality of a constitution and said, wait a moment. A constitution is not only a legal text, it's not only an instrument for lawyers, like many other laws, like the big civil law, if you look into civil laws in Germany and in many other countries. That's so complicated. This is for experts, this is for specialists. You would not expect an ordinary citizen or a medical doctor or so to read these rules and laws. That would be very strange. But you would expect to understand, the ordinary person, a constitution, to have an idea what the constitution is all about. And Heberle said the constitution is also an expression of culture. It's closely linked to the very culture of a political community. It resembles the culture. It resembles, the political culture. It resembles the economy. It resembles the social infrastructure of a people. And so Peter Heberle came up with his very famous definition. I think that's also already quite well known in Brazil. Maybe you already have heard of it. If I may quote, a constitution is not only a legal set of rules, but also an expression of a state of cultural development, a means of cultural self-expression of the people, a mirror of its cultural heritage, and the foundation of its hope. Heberle was the constitutional thinker who developed a much more open understanding of a constitution. His open understanding of a constitution also had methodological consequences. He said a constitution is not only a text to be interpreted by experts, by lawyers, by constitutional courts only, but he came up with his most influential idea of an open society of constitutional interpreters. He said every human being, every citizen, who participates in political processes is to some extent exercising and interpreting the Constitution. If you rely on one of your basic rights that are granted in the Constitution, if you rely on your freedom to express your opinion, or on your freedom to assemble, or on your freedom to a certain religious belief, if you rely on these freedoms, then you to some extent interpret the Constitution, you live the Constitution. You do something with the Constitution, being aware, this is my entitlement, I may do that. I can participate in the political process. I can criticize the governing parties, even though that might not be popular, but I can do it because I got the entitlement. I can do that even though I might belong to a minority, even though the majority sees political things in a very different way. I can express my views, and I can fight that maybe my minority of today will become the majority in the future. I can express my religious beliefs, even though they might be contrary to the religious beliefs of the majority. Or I can express the very fact that I do not share any religious beliefs, that I'm not a believer, I don't deal with that things. I also can do that, quite strongly so. I think that is the most influential part of Heberle's constitutional theory, opening it to that, methodological approach of an open society of constitutional interpreters. Heberle said once, rephrasing Hegel, that constitution is its time framed in different thoughts. Constitution resembles the very time in which it has been drafted and also the time in which it is interpreted. A constitution reflects the very shape of a political community. And of course, it's linked not only to the legal world, but to the real world, to politics, to the economy, and so on. A constitution can only be understood and has to be interpreted in its relevant contexts. A contextualized approach to constitutional interpretation. I think that is the next very important perspective of constitutional thought in Germany. Do not only focus on the legal text and do not only apply the instruments of legal hermeneutics, like the grammar, the wording, or original intentionalism, or what the framers believed, or the systematic or the teleologic dimension, but also look at the context, because the way we understand the Constitution is pretty much influenced by the world in which we live in. And I can give you a quite nice example, that I think makes that quite clear. In the German Constitution that has been drafted in the year 1949, there is a guarantee of the freedom of the press, the freedom of film, and the freedom of radio. No mentioning of television, let alone the internet. Now, for a very obvious reason. in 1949, you know, television was not well-developed technology in Germany, so the framers of the Constitution did have television not in their minds. And of course, the internet was something nobody could dream of, you know. That is something that was invented, you know, some 40, 50 years later. Therefore, that of course could not be included in the constitutional text. If we today read about, you know, the freedom of television, radio, and so on, we think about all media, you know. We think today about the freedom of the media. And that got to do with the context in which we live in, yeah? You know, we, in particular, the young generation, the digital natives, they could not see a world and understand a world, you know, where a telephone call would be something very exciting and where you could not use the internet. You know, we could, you know, in particular in these times of the pandemic, how could we communicate with the internet? We take that for granted. You know, we have online lectures, we have online parties, we meet our friends online and so on. We are living in a world where, you know, in our thinking about the political community, online means and online instruments play a most important role. And of course, that's a very relevant context of how we understand and interpret the Constitution and further develop a Constitution, enshrining new guarantees and taking into account these new societal developments and also technological developments. That is, I think, the key feature of that open concept of a constitution. Let me, before we come to your questions, conclude that presentations with two further aspects: the European Constitution and constitutional thinking on the global plane. The European Union, as you all know, is not a state. And it's definitely not a federal state. It's a public international law entity of its own. It got a very own supranational infrastructure. It got quite a lot of powers and so on. The European Union definitely can do something which was formerly exclusively granted to the state. It can exercise public power. And remember the definition of a constitution that I gave you. A constitution is about legitimizing, making possible, organizing, limiting, and controlling public power. If an entity not being a state is doing exactly that, exercising public power, then that entity needs a source of legitimacy. And this is the reason, you know, why a constitutional debate started on the European plane. Why legal scholars, not only in Germany, but also in the other member states of the European Union, thought we also need on the union plane legitimacy. The rule of law is relevant also for the legal architecture of the European Union. Democracy is something which also should be resembled and reflected on the union plane, because the union got granted quite important political powers to make very important political decisions and to make laws that govern the people in the member states, and therefore the European Union also should have a constitution. And therefore scholars, the end of the last century in the 1990s, started debating, and the debate got quite heated in the early 2000s, started debating about a European constitution, started about, you know, a treaty framework that could be understood as a constitutional treaty. If you are a bit familiar with EU law, you might know that the draft of a constitutional treaty failed in 2005. However, the very idea of a constitution on the European Union plane is still very present. You know, the very idea that the power exercised by the union needs to be legitimized, limited, and controlled, as state power needs to be legitimized, limited, and controlled. And since the European Union is composed of its member states, the European constitutional thought is a constitutional thought of networks. European constitutionalism conceives the European Union as a community, a political union, based on the very constitutions of its member states. And therefore, European constitutional thought in that sense operates with the idea of an assembly of different constitutional schemes. The constitution, the constitutional network of the European Union is, as Peter Heberle describes it, a constitutional community composed of the constitutions of the now 27 member states, composed of the treaties founding the European Union, but also composed of the European Charter on Human Rights, which binds all member states. So the European Constitution is composed of these very different elements. On the European plane, there does not exist a complete constitution of its own, but on the European plane, there exists a form of political entity that integrates its own political principles and the constitutions of its member states to an ensemble. And Article 2 of the EU Treaty reflects that by saying that union is based on the most important constitutional features: human rights, democracy, the rule of law, equality, and so on. So the constitutional contents are resembled by that value article in the treaty framework of the European Union. And therefore, the very idea of a constitution had been dissolved from its state-bound origin and now also been attributed to the European Union. And lastly, even on the international plane, that thought to legitimize public power, which is exercised by non-state entities, became kind of, prominent or attractive. Of course, there is no global constitution, there is no world constitution. It would be absolutely nonsense to argue that. However, we see that the United Nations, the WTO, in the time of pandemic, WHO, and other international organizations are quite influential. Yeah, they are establishing rules. There are treaty-based, treaty-made rules by multilateral treaty regimes. And this is also to some extent an exercise of public power. And why do sovereign states at all agree that they might share, at least to a tiny little bit, their sovereignty with international actors? For a very simple reason. They see that they can fulfill the most important key functions they should fulfill, not any longer just on their own. Some examples, the protection of the environment and climate. The state alone can't do it. You can have the perfect scheme, you can have very restrictive environmental laws. It doesn't help because, environmental pollution does not stop at state borders. So if you want to have an effective solution that helps all mankind, you need to cooperate, you need to come to an international solution. The state cannot fulfill the function to protect the environment in the interest of its citizens anymore just on itself. Second example, if you look at the fight against terrorism, you can have perfect rules and close your borders and whatever, but if there are international networks of terrorists, if you want to fight IS or Al-Qaeda or, Daesh, you need to cooperate. You need to do it together with other states, with other strong partners. Of course, otherwise, it's not going to work. The global pandemic we are facing, if we do not have some common strategies and support each other, I think it's very difficult to really govern that global pandemic. It's very difficult to do that. And the same holds, of course, true for global economy and global financial systems. I think that's a lesson we learned in 2008 when we were facing the big financial crisis, you know, everything is so interconnected and intertwined, you know. The failure of these two banks in the United States of America led to a big crisis also in your country, in the European Union, in all European countries. We can't ignore that and say, oh, we are a sovereign state, we have our constitution, we do all things by ourselves. It's not gonna work because we are dependent on other states and nations. We are so intertwined, interconnected, and dependent from each other. So there should be also kind of, you know, cooperative constitutional architectures and cooperative elements of a constitution on the international plane. A final remark that brings us, I think, at the end of that presentation, back to the very foundations of constitutional thought. Why do we need a constitution? Because public power needs to be legitimized. If we do not want to rely in God-given king anymore. Public power needs to be organized because otherwise it can't be exercised effectively. It needs to be limited and controlled. And that holds true whether public power is exercised within a nation state, within a regional entity, the European Union, or in Latin America, South America, Mercosur. Of course, very different still from the European Union, but still there are some tiny little elements of public power. Or if public power is organized by international institutions and international entities. Therefore, we see the Constitution is something that changes in the course of time. The Canadian Supreme Court had the wonderful metaphor that the Constitution is a living instrument that to some extent reacts, resembles, adapts to the changing real-world condition in which it is embedded in and in which it shall exercise its constitutional functions. We should keep that in mind, and we hope for a very prosperous future for that living tree, for that living instrument which a constitution can be described as. Thank you very much for your kind attendance, and of course I'm open for any kind of questions. Again, thank you very much, and thank you very much for that wonderful invitation.
Thank you so much, Professor Kotzur, for your amazing lecture. It was an honor for us to hear you. It's a great opportunity for me and for my students to learn a little more about German law and its importance. To us in Brazil. I hope in the future we can have you in presence in our university. It will be a special time and experience.
It would be my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, let's hope it can be true in the future. And now I would like to hear Professor Dr. Diogo Oliveira about any questions for Professor Kotzur.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for your lecture. It's really rich and showing the students the development of the German Constitution and the German thinking about constitutional law. In Brazil, we have a great influence from German law, especially the thinking of Professor Vita, especially in our Supreme Court and especially in our constitutional control law that we in Brazil are adopting the open society thinking about constructing the constitution of Brazil, thinking in Brazil, sorry. I have a doubt. As Germany is a beacon for us in constitutional law, I'd like to hear your thinking, if it's possible, about the one particular thinking of Professor that he says that we have to hear all the participants of the social dialogue. have to hear all of them, minority and minority. Nowadays, we have a little problem, not actually little, huge problem with in America, Google, YouTube, and Twitter, that they are restraining the political and social dialogue. You hear this kind of problem in Brazil, United States, United Kingdom, Hungary. And is there any concern, or is there any particular discussion in Germany nowadays about this subject?
Yep. Thank you very much for that question. I think it's a very important question, and there is strong concern in Germany about these questions because, as you said, the open society of constitutional interpreters, the open society in which all participants of the social dialogue can be influential, has a very important prerequisite: the chance to participate in that dialogue, not to be excluded from the dialogue. And there are many reasons why you may be, or why you potentially could be, excluded from the dialogue. It could be because you are economically in such a weak position that you do not participate and do not want to participate in political dialogues, because the only thing you do is, fighting that you have enough food to survive the next day. Or education, you are not so well educated that you believe that you really can participate, that you have to say something. And I think the most important obstacle is what you just mentioned, the World Wide Web, social media, and the internet, because that is the instrument to, in the ideal world, to realize the perfect social dialogue. Never before it has been so easy that really everyone, or more or less everyone, the only thing you need is an internet connection. You can participate. You can participate in political discourses. The limits are very low. You have your message, and your message, even though you are not interviewed by a big newspaper or by a big TV station, what you got to say and what you share via internet can be heard worldwide. So that is actually the ideal platform, the ideal forum for the open society of constitutional interpreters. But on the other side, I think we learned about, the grand dangers of that, World Wide Web, hate speech, fake news, all the types of, misuse. And therefore, there is also a strong tendency that you want to effectively control the internet. And I think here we see the tricky problem, If you have a strict regime of controlling, of kicking out opinions you don't want to have, you do not believe to be appropriate, then you exclude participants necessarily from that kind of, global dialogue, from the social dialogue, then participants are excluded. If you have no instruments of control at all, you allow for hatred, you allow for fake news, you allow that, people are offended that, crimes against humanity can be endorsed, and that people would write something, what they wanted to do against Muslims and the Jews, and so on and so forth. So I think the most tricky problem is to find, when it comes to internet governance, the right balance, of control, of necessary control, and of necessary participation. And I think not only in Germany, but also in many other countries, and I'm quite sure also in Brazil, the question is who should rule, Is it national rules to protect the internet, or should there be a global instrument, a global internet governance, which would make things much better? If you react like a state like China and say, okay, our citizens are not allowed to Google, they are not allowed to use social media, they only can use what we in China allow them to use, then of course you have horrible censorship. That's not gonna work. I think that is definitely not the option, not the solution. I think the big thing is to develop control standards that fulfill the requirements of freedom of speech, and to kind of, create a world of internet access that really grants equal access and equal chances to participate for everyone. And I think that is, not only a legal question, but also it's a question of technical infrastructure that, that wherever you live, you have internet access, and that you have at least basic means to articulate yourself, to express your opinion, to participate in that kind of discussions without, falling in the trap of hatred and fake news. I would not have any perfect answer how that question can be dissolved. But I think this is one of the big constitutional questions that will be addressed during the next decades, because internet governance and the form and the question of how to constitutionalize that, internet-based social dialogue, I think this is a technological, a societal, and also a legal challenge for definitely the first half of the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Professor.
More than welcome.
Thank you, Diogo, for your question, and thank you, Professor Markus, for the answer. 3 years ago, I was in Gießen, Universität Gießen, for postdoctoral studies, and I was really impressed how about all the university was discussing about fake news. And at that time in Brazil, it was so new. It was before Bolsonaro, but in the university in Gießen, it was discussed all the time. And it was really impressive for me, because we know all the things happened before, after that in Brazil, because of fake news and the impact on the elections. So it was really a good question and a good answer. And Professor Markus, I personally have 3 questions that I would like to make to you, and feel free if you want to answer or not. First of all, I don't know if you know everything is happening in Brazil now, but there is an important question for us. There is the power of judicial activism and the impact on democracy, and how big should be the judicial power in a democracy, and even if the people and the society claims for justice, or what they think that are justice. And this is a first point. It's about the reality in Brazil now, but about the future. I have a special question, and it's about what I am studying now. It's about rights of nature. I don't know if you probably know about Constitution of Ecuador and Bolivia, and they have a different comprehension about subject in law, and it's a kind of biocentric or ecocentric view. And because of all the things that are happening in Brazil in the environmental cases of crimes and disasters, I think the future can have this changing of perspective. And I don't know what you think about it. In Germany, I think you have a kind of relative anthropocentric. It's not so hard like in Brazil, but I think there is a demand for future to change a little more, and to make a different whole for nature and for animals. And it's a question that I am studying now. And what do you think about the possibility of changing the concept of subject in law to engulf all the life beings? And the third point is about my experience. When I was in Germany in postdoctoral research, I was with Professor Marietta Auer in Gießen, but always talking with Professor Heberly about constitutional problems. And the last time I saw him, we talked about my research in development and culture. and I was researching on it for many years, and he told me that time to not study it anymore, because in the future, the subject of future will be peace, the most important subject in future. And I would like to know if you agree, and if you not agree, what is the subject most important for our global society in the future? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful, but of course, very difficult question. The first question, the influence of judges and judicial activism and the limits of judicial activism, I think this is an eternal question of justice, and in particular, an eternal question of constitutional justice. We in Germany, as you might know, have a very strong and a very influential constitutional court, and to some extent, you know, a very activist court. And the court can be so activist because he enjoys a high esteem by the people. You know, it is thought to be a very credible institution. And to some extent, you know, people rather believe in the kind of, you know, independent esteem, in the independent evaluation of judges than in those of active politicians. However, our court is also harshly criticized for, you know, going way beyond what, you know, adjudication should look like, and really into the field of policy making. I think if you follow a philosophy of you know, an open constitution, you never will be able to draw a clear line between constitutional activism, that's a positive thing that contributes to development, and judges going beyond the edge. I think there is not a clear distinction, and all the recipes, you know, that are offered to have, you know, a clear distinction, they, in my opinion, do not function and work. If you look, you know, at the Americans with the influential theory of original intentionalism. Original intentionalism is also only one way of interpretation, saying, you know, how I see what the framers did, that's the way a constitution should look like. This is also, to some extent, an activist interpretation of the constitution, because in an activist way, endorsing the understanding of a legal term is used in the 18th century, or as we believe it was used in the 18th century, because we haven't experienced it, we haven't been living in the 18th century. So I think that balancing between how far can courts go, that can't be answered by, you know, clear-cut lines. And I think there should be political controversies. Judges, to some extent, are, if you wish it or not, also political actors, and therefore there should be an ongoing political debate also on the power and on the way how judges, you know, act, how far they go. And I think that's quite strong in Europe, because, you know, there are so many tensions between the European Court of Justice, the national constitutional courts, the national constitutional courts, and the relevant national parliaments, and so on. And I think that kind of, you know, clear public and also scientific debates are the most helpful ones. But the old kind of, you know, Montesquieuian picture that, you know, judges are only the mouth of the law, kind of, you know, speaking, explaining the law, and very naive. I think that never was reality, and therefore to draw the line between, you know, legitimate judicial activism and a violation of the separation of powers principle, it needs, you know, as an ongoing process, also day-to-day adjustments. I could not draw a very clear line of distinction. Your second question, rights of nature, that's very provocative and challenging, because it's very different to, you know, the concept of human rights as we have it developed in the Western world. But I think that is a very interesting example, you know, how comparative perspective work, and, you know, how constitutions interact with each other. There is quite a strong ongoing debate now on laws of nature, because we receive, and, you know, young law students write PhD papers about the Constitution of Bolivia, about the rights of nature in other parts of the world, and try to further develop. So there is a strong reception, you know, and all of a sudden, which is very important, it's not the Western constitutions, the American constitution, the German constitution, who is the role model and the icon that we want to follow. All of a sudden, it's the Bolivian constitution saying, oh, wow, they got that. How innovative, how innovating, how kind of provocative. And of course, there are very contested and controversial debates on that. But I think these thoughts are influential, and they might in the future also kind of provoke a shift between the very anthropocentric concept of environmental law as we have in Europe to a more ecocentric concept of environmental law. That's not something that we will face tomorrow, that will be happening tomorrow, but you know, that is a very continuous process, and that got to do with reception, with comparative perspectives. And you know, our young law students are quite excited about, you know, these new theories about, you know, rivers having all of a sudden legal personality and stuff like that. And they try to conceptualize that. And that's very popular seminar papers. So the University of Hamburg, we are hosting an exchange program with an Australian university, and international environmental law plays a key role, and it's very popular. So many students want to participate, and rights of nature, and that's very exciting for them. And it shows me, you know, if the young generation is so into the thing, you know, their change might, you know, become true in the future. And in particular, you know, Latin American constitutions, also Asian constitutions, Australian concepts will be very concept and very influential in the old world, learning from the new world. I think that is a very important thing. And comparison is never a one-way road. We really truly learn from each other, and that's the perfect example. The last question, peace. Yeah, yes, of course, I think peace is the most fundamental question of any legal order. This is what we want to achieve at the end of the day. And peace might become more and more important the more conflicts we face on the surface of this earth. And I think, you know, important reasons for conflicts in the future will be, you know, limited resources, the fight for resources. You know, we want to have access to energy, we want to have access to natural resources. That is very important. So that will be something that can create new conflicts. And, you know, since climate change also will make some parts of the world more difficult to be populated by human beings, I think we will face huge migration movements. And migration is also a problem that, you know, usually raises big conflicts and can kind of, you know, destabilize political entities. And we might also face new types of conflicts, not the traditional kind of, you know, conflict and war situations that we're facing in the 20th century, and also not those ones that we are facing today in Syria or Libya or in all the conflict scenarios we are very well aware of, or the conflict between North Korea and the rest of the world, but, you know, much more complex conflicts. And therefore, I think peace is indeed the very topic of the future, but it's also very much connected, you know, with, you know, your research on culture, because peace and culture can't be separated from each other. The cultural embeddedness of peace is as obvious as the cultural embeddedness of the law. And, you know, sometimes we believe as lawyers that we can keep peace just by making law. I think making law and the legal-based international order is a very important part to secure peace. Peace through law is important, but law is not the only mean to secure peace. And therefore, I think we need to discuss that kind of, you know, peace question in the big context also of culture. So the focus on peace would not exclude the focus on culture, on the contrary.
I absolutely agree, Professor. Thank you so much for the answers. I will try to summarize some questions for the students on YouTube because of the time. So what do you have here? One of these questions is about facing your lecture. It will be possible to conclude that we should not have the hard clause in Constitution, the stone one, that we can change even for amendment. or still is possible to have this clause in a strong constitution? Is one of them. And the other is about abortion and death penalty, if it's subject that should be in the modern constitution.
Very difficult question. So when it comes to the way to amend the constitution, we have different models. You know, in the US, there is no way to change the text of the constitution. That is more or less sacred. You only can amend the constitution. In Germany, we have a mechanism to change the text of the constitution by a very complex and a complicated majority. I think since the constitution is a living instrument, you should be in the position to change or amend it. I think that's very important. And even though the constitution is very important, it's not kind of, you know, like a biblical text that you can never change. You can change it, but you got to be very careful. If you change a constitution too often, yeah, and if you kind of, you know, from a day-to-day perspective, you know, very short-sighted, short-lived ideas, and you always, oh, we make that a constitutional question, I think you endanger the whole concept of a constitution. Therefore, changes, amendments of a constitution should be limited to, again, very crucial, very fundamental questions. But, you know, that should be possible in the constitution. The text of a constitution, I think, can be changed. But sometimes, and that was my argument, you do not even have to change the legal text of the constitution because, you know, we have an open interpretation, we have a procedural understanding of an interpretation, and we can come to a new understanding of, you know, what's enshrined in the constitution without changing the text of the constitution. That is, again, you know, the process, how far can the judiciary go, and one needs to find the right balance. But, you know, to a very limited extent, I think constitutional changes and amendments should be foreseen. They should be kind of, you know, governed by a very strict qualified majority. Changing the constitution should not become a day-to-day instrument of, you know, political fights, but it should be possible. The issue of abortion and of death penalty, you know, that's very, very tricky and very critical question because these are highly ethical questions. Death penalty, from a European standpoint, there is a quite clear answer. Death penalty also under the human rights instruments in Europe, under the European Convention. Death penalty, there is an additional protocol thing. We are not going to have that. So all member states of the European Union, for instance, agreed not to have death penalty in the constitution. We have a clear prohibition of death penalty in our constitution. However, that depends on, you know, the legal culture and the legal experiences of the past. The Americans still do have death penalty, and their constitution is one of the strongest and most traditional ones. Personally, I'm opposed to death penalty for very many different reasons, also for religious, ethical, and other reasons. But, you know, you still can have the instrument of death penalty in the constitution without giving up the constitution's quality. But, you know, from a European perspective, death penalty is something which should be forbidden, which should be prohibited. That at least is common sense amongst the member states of the, you know, European Union and the Council of Europe. Abortion in that regard is a much more tricky issue because abortion is, you know, much more an ethical issue. And I think it's also very tricky to argue, you know, how progressive, you know, one can be when it comes to abortion. The American Supreme Court, with its, you know, right to privacy, was quite progressive when it comes to abortion. In Germany, our constitutional court is much more restrictive, saying no, you know, without having clear justifying circumstances. Abortion would be always illegal because of the human dignity also of the embryo. However, a woman can be in such a difficult situation that abortion might be illegal, but, you know, not punishable. And that has been seen as a very Solomonic solution by the Federal Constitutional Court in its last decision on abortion. From a dogmatic perspective, that's very strange because that's a new figure in criminal law to say, yeah, it is illegal, it can't be justified, but you're nevertheless not guilty. Why? Yeah, because of the very stressful influences and so on. But I think it was in that regard, a Solomonic question, because still leaving it open to, you know, political debates and ethical choices and moral choices. I think the abortion debate and abortion discussion is something we see that in the US, we see that in many other countries. We can't suppress anyway. There should be open debates about it, but without hatred. I think it's very dangerous if, you know, religious fundamentalists become violent, you know, fighting against abortion. You know, they want to protect life and risk, you know, to endanger lives in the way they express their kind of, you know, very, very rigid wishes and kind of, you know, very moralist wishes. And of course, I think you always got to see the perspective of the very woman. Otherwise, you know, even a strongly religious or moralist perspectives is ignorant of a human being that also enjoys entitlements, and also from a very religious perspective and point of view should be taken really seriously. Therefore, you know, I'd not advise any constitution to have an express regulation of abortion or to an express regulation that abortion either got to be allowed or got to be necessarily forbidden. But I think, you know, a constitution that has the basic human right to life allows for the necessary adjustment and allows for the necessary political debates that a society can live with that regulations. And I think the German experience, that's quite interesting, you know, that kind of, you know, undogmatic, but Solomonic solution of the German constitutional thing, yeah, it's illegal because we really got to protect the unborn child, but it's not punishable because we really need to take into account the situation of the woman, and it's not punishable only under very certain circumstances. For instance, if you had kind of, you know, consultations before and you got advice. I think that's a solution that is broadly accepted by German society and that really kind of, you know, helped to cool down the debates. And I think that is an approach which I find very reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was a question by Diogo D from YouTube. Thank you, Tiago. And now I would like to hear Professor Jonathan Vita for questions or considerations.
Thank you, Professor Mariana. I was really glad to hear all the lecture. And two main points have arisen from that. And the first one is really interesting for us because everyone here in Brazil discusses Kaisen on you know, the graduation program and not only on the postgraduate program, as in Germany, because even though we really reflect German constitutional theory and constitutional law, we actually deal with that on a daily basis in our graduation courses and not only on the PhD and masters. So this is a really interesting difference between the Brazilian approach on the graduation program instead of the postgraduate program. This is just a greater remark. But the second one is more of a question, because we know that in the United States, we have the really big discussion between the originalists and the non-originalists interpretation of constitutional law. And actually, we can find some similarities, for example, in the early works under the Nazi regime, for example, in which we have a variance of authors and approaches over that. So I would like for you to comment on the two visions within the authors that you have discussed in the beginning of the lecture.
And thank you very much. I think Kaisen is still, of course, a very prominent figure in legal theory in Europe, but I think Kaisen plays not that kind of, you know, singular role anymore that it used to play earlier, because I think, you know, in Germany, there is a mainstream jurisprudence that is kind of critical to a very restrictive positivism and to a very kind of, you know, limited positivist legal thinking. It was quite strong, and the debates were quite strong under the Weimar Constitution. And of course, Kaisen was one of those saying only the positive constitution, whereas, you know, Smith would go beyond that and saying integration and procedural understanding. But that kind of, you know, debates are not that strong anymore. I think in Germany we have, and there are of course exceptions, but, you know, the typical originalist approach in the US, like Anthony Scalia and others, and Burke, that is something that in Germany and also in many other European countries, nobody really follows anymore, because, you know, we would argue, you know, that is very naive hermeneutics. That is kind of, you know, a literal understanding, an interpretation which kind of, you know, hides its intentions, because it's always an act of interpretation. And if we say, oh, we understand a term in the way it was understood in the 18th century, we of course interpret the term. And if we say the framers of the Constitution wanted that and that, of course, we attribute that to the framers from, you know, the perspective of March 17 in the year 2021, and not in the year 1800 something or 1900 something. And we got to be very aware of that. Therefore, originalism in Germany doesn't play any, I think, important role anymore, in particular not in law school education. Our legal interpretation in that regard is quite different. And it's interesting if you do something like that with German law students, you know, in a comparative law class or legal theory class, and you read with them, you know, these papers on originalism in the US. For the students, this is like, you know, stories from a very strange world. This is something they really do not get anymore, and that's very, very alien for them. It's not very popular. And also, Kaisen in Germany is received, you know, not as the strict positivist. I think Kaisen is received now in a much more differentiated way. There is lots of writings about Kaisen and about him being not the kind of, you know, hardcore positivist as it was kind of, you know, misintroduced for many years, but, you know, much more differentiated and so on. And Kaisen is much more, you know, famous for its kind of, you know, hierarchy of norms, Grundnorm theory, and also, you know, jurisprudence and independent constitutional courts. But, you know, pure and strict positivism is not very popular in Germany. And even the colleagues who would describe themselves as positivists would describe themselves as enlightened positivists, being aware that, you know, a text needs to be understood in its context. And therefore, I think the debates in that regard are very different in Germany and in the US. And the really originalism and original intentionalism is something which our law students don't get. And if you tell them, oh, there is original intent, they are like, what the hell is he talking about? Even the term is for them already quite alien. This is not on the table here.
Yeah, no, because actually, even though for us, and yes, in continental Europe, it's a foreign concept, in the US Supreme Court is really gaining traction, because actually now we may have 3 of the 9 justices that are originalists. And when Scalia was there, it was really, really foreign. But now it's becoming, quote unquote, mainstream over that. So it's really interesting that we have this bifurcation of ideas and the way of interpreting the Constitution. So it's really, really, and to us, it's also a bit striking, even though in my field of expertise, which is international taxation, we have many discussions over some terms that are evolving within the society, for example, royalties and intellectual property and all of that, and services which are evolving and some people still want to go back to the Romans and say, no, it's a obligation to do, an obligation to perform, or something like that. So it's really interesting to get that perspective. And it was obviously a provocation in order for you to elaborate more on that.
Oh, thank you very much. And then I think a very important remark you made, saying that now the American Supreme Court becomes more originalist again. And I think it will be interesting to see, you know, how strong the influence of the American Supreme Court also on legal thinking in Europe will be in the future. Because, of course, what the American Supreme Court does is received in Europe and can start kind of, you know, legal debates in Europe, you know, Brown versus Board of Education, big reception, and Roe versus Wade. And of course, all these famous judgments, they are very well received in Europe. And there's, I think, strong open ears, and therefore also original intentionalism could become again, you know, more popular. And it depends also on political debates. You know, if you have a strong political debate about, you know, judges misusing their power and that kind of, you know, populist streams who kind of, you know, totally mistrust any kind of elites, you know, then I think it's becoming an interesting thing to say, yeah, these elites, they want, you know, to only exercise their power, and therefore, you know, original intentionalism is something which we got to rely on, which of course is very short-sighted, because the text, you know, of the 18th century have also been written by elites, not by the ordinary people. You know, the American Constitution is not, you know, the bottom-up thing of, you know, the American people, but it's a text that was written by drafters that have been, you know, intellectuals, European intellectuals, strongly influenced by the great European thinkers and the French Revolution and so on. But, you know, to really tell that complex story to people who are politically radicalized, it's very difficult. And therefore, I'm interested also to see, you know, whether, you know, that, you know, turn in American jurisprudence will have an influence on legal theory in Europe again, because, you know, there's, you know, worldwide reception. And if there is an interesting idea coming up and a good scholar, you know, picking it up and writing an interesting article, all of a sudden there we go and we have the big debate.
And actually, I believe that maybe the originalists are maybe the most polar opposites of activists in the judicial perception. So it's a way in which to create some balance between those positions, because the activists, in the sense that we perceive in Brazil, the Supreme Court is really moving forward in order to even discard, for example, the meaning of the Constitution and go further and even go to create positive law or black law in that extent.
Yeah, I think that's a problem with the very activist court. And of course, you also got a very broad constitution. You know, you have a constitution which is very detailed. You know, I said, you know, according to one theory in Germany, a constitution only should regulate the very basic questions. There, the Brazilian constitution would not be the perfect example, because it's a very rich, you know, constitution that regulates quite a lot. And of course, if you regulate so many, you know, things in the constitution, you open many avenues for judicial jurisprudence. That's also a bit, you know, the risky thing. And therefore, you know, activist courts might be seen as in particular dangerous. And I think that there we go and have the problem, you know, if we have a very divided society, if we have right-wing activists and left-wing activists and these fights, you know, and all of a sudden, you know, the judges are to protect the democracy as such and so on, things get very difficult. If you're living in a very stable and working democracy and rule of law based country, well, then, you know, you got some tensions, but they might not be as strong. But of course, it's also tricky if judges, and maybe for very good purposes, feel that they got to fight for everything or nothing. And then you might become very political, and that also can erode trust in judges. I think it's a very difficult situation and a tricky situation, and it should be openly, absolutely openly discussed, because, you know, judicial activism also has its limits, as I said before. Therefore, I find it quite exciting, you know, how things are dealt with in Brazil. And of course, you got also something which we, to some extent, are envious. You got the amicus curiae, the thing also the Americans have, and that is something that fits perfectly also in the theoretical world of Peter Heberle. But on the other side, you know, the more material you give a judge, you know, the higher is the risk that he will make something out of it. Yeah, and if you can get amicus curiae briefs from interest groups and lobby groups and so on, it's much more, you know, likely that a judge might invent, you know, a right of blah, 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 than sitting on his study desk and saying, well, it's not there, I have no idea. So, you know, the more open a process is, and that is maybe also a critical remark to the Open Society of Constitutional Interpreters, even though I'm convinced of the concept, but, you know, that's the risky part. The more people got to say and say, yeah, but the Constitution also means that and that and that and that, and we net that right and that entitlement, and you got the lobbies, you got the interest groups, you get political fights, and you've got interest groups who know how to handle the media and how to play as a prominent topic, then all of a sudden, you know, the impact on judicial decision-making might become stronger and stronger, and that indeed is a risk. And I think there was also one question about, you know, the risk of misusing, you know, the Open Society of Constitutional Interpreters, internet participation and so on. And I think that's quite a tricky question. And the more formal avenues you have that the court needs to take into consideration tons of arguments and statements by people who are not infected by the lawsuit, things get difficult. Therefore, in Germany, we still believe, you know, that individual rights-based thing, you only should be able to engage into a lawsuit if you are, you know, affected, not as a third party.
That's great. Mariana?
Thank you, Professor Jonathan, for the questions and comments, and thank you, Professor Markus, for all the answers. And I don't know if I should say that, but I think that all that question in Brazil is a thing that is related to. In Brazil, we have a battle between that ones that are very happy with the German influencing law, like me, and another group that would prefer the North American influence, and it's not so silent. Now there is a battle about it in Brazil, and I think there are many amazing things in North American and English law, but we have a question related to Brazilian culture. We have been always, for all the time, a civil law country with a strong constitution, and judges, I think they have to respect it. And I'm not saying that judicial activism is always bad, but sometimes in Brazil it's completely against the law. So we have to be careful about it, because the power of the influence that it has on democracy. I think the world see it about Brazil now, because we have all political questions that are being seen for the world. So thank you for talking with us about it, and to emphasize this German influence that is so important to us for Brazilian law and for Brazilian culture. And I think your presence here today will enlighten these young students to research about this traditional German law, and it will be fantastic to our university. Thanks, many thanks. And I really hope to have you in presence in our university in future when the pandemic is over. Amen. And now,
thank you so much. It was my great pleasure, and it would be my great pleasure to one day visit you. Thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed it.
you, Professor. Now a little Portuguese to my students. Queridos alunos, que presente, que oportunidade vocês tiveram hoje com a aula incrível do professor Markus Kotzur. Obrigada pela presença e pelo compromisso de vocês. Sem isso, nós não teríamos internacionalização. Nós sabemos que é mais difícil quando um evento acontece integralmente em inglês. E a presença de vocês hoje mostra como vocês estão dispostos a evoluir em suas pesquisas, nos seus estudos, mesmo em tempos de pandemia. Isso, para nós, é um sinal de esperança. Muito obrigada pela presença de vocês. Eu aguardo vocês na próxima quarta-feira para mais um evento aqui no Diálogos sobre Desenvolvimento, Empresa e Sociedade. E uma boa tarde a todos.